I need you girls to move. Now!" The flight attendant's smile didn't reach her eyes, only sharpened them. Like knives. 13-year-old Maya gripped her book tighter. "Offensive odor," she'd said. The lie was so thick you could choke on it. Problem was, Patricia, the flight attendant, had picked the wrong kids to mess with. See, what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was whose kids they were. Not just any executive's offspring, but David Wellington's, the CEO. And these twins? Well, their quiet kindness. Their daddy taught them to fight back, document everything. They have no idea how her quiet kindness will change everything. We've received multiple complaints about an offensive odor, and I need to address this situation before it becomes a bigger problem for other passengers. Welcome back to Black and Bruised Stories. If you're new here, you've just joined a community dedicated to truth, justice, and survival. Show some love by clicking the like and subscribe button. Before we dive deeper into this story, drop a comment where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. Maya and Mia Wellington looked up from their novels with the kind of surprised confusion that only innocent children can display when confronted with adult cruelty they don't yet understand. At 13 years old, these twins represented everything beautiful about childhood. Polite, well-dressed in matching navy blazers and pleated skirts, their natural hair styled in neat, protective braids adorned with small gold beads that caught the cabin lighting. They sat with perfect posture, their expensive leather book bags tucked neatly under the seats in front of them, their boarding passes clearly displaying business class in bold letters. But to Patricia Morrison, senior flight attendant with 15 years of experience and a documented history of treating passengers differently based on nothing more than the color of their skin. These two children represented something that didn't belong in the premium cabin she considered her personal domain. The accusation of body odor was as fabricated as it was cruel, a lie so transparent that several nearby passengers immediately looked around in confusion, trying to identify any unpleasant smell that simply didn't exist. The twins had boarded the aircraft 45 minutes earlier, politely thanking the gate agent, quietly settling into their assigned seats, and immediately pulling out books to read during the 3-hour flight from Chicago to Miami, where their father would be waiting to pick them up after his business conference. Maya, the more outspoken of the twins by exactly 7 minutes of birth order, spoke first with the careful diction her parents had taught her for dealing with difficult adults. "Excuse me, Mom, but I think there might be some mistake. These are our assigned seats, and we have our boarding passes right here." She held up the printed documents with the same precision her father used in boardroom presentations, though she had no idea that her calm professionalism in the face of discrimination was being witnessed by dozens of passengers who would soon understand they were watching something far more significant than a routine seating dispute. Patricia's expression hardened at being questioned by a child, her prejudices flaring at the audacity of these young black girls who dared to challenge her fabricated authority. In her 15 years of airline service, she perfected the art of disguising racial bias as legitimate passenger management, targeting families and individuals who she believed couldn't or wouldn't fight back against her discriminatory treatment. "Little girl, I don't need to see your boarding passes," Patricia snapped, her voice loud enough to draw attention from passengers throughout the first-class cabin. "I have multiple passenger complaints about hygiene issues, and it's my responsibility to ensure the comfort of all travelers on this aircraft. You and your sister need to collect your things and move to the back of the plane, where you'll be more comfortable." The lie hung in the air like poison, so obviously false that it insulted the intelligence of everyone within hearing distance. Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman in seat 1C, looked up from her crossword puzzle with genuine bewilderment. "I'm sorry, but what odor?" she asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone unaccustomed to being ignored. "I've been sitting right here since boarding, and I haven't noticed any unpleasant smells. These young ladies have been perfectly quiet and well behaved." A businessman in seat 3A nodded in agreement, folding his newspaper with the decisive gesture of someone preparing to get involved in a situation that was clearly wrong. "I have to agree with Mrs. Chin. There's no odor that I can detect, and these children have been model passengers since they boarded." But Patricia was too committed to her discriminatory course of action to be deterred by contradictory evidence from actual witnesses. She'd learned over the years that passengers rarely challenged flight crew authority directly, and she'd grown comfortable with the power dynamics that allowed her to treat certain families, particularly minority families, however her prejudices dictated. Mia, who typically let her sister handle confrontational situations, surprised everyone by speaking up with a quiet confidence that belied her 13 years. "Ma'am, our daddy always told us to be respectful to airline crew, but he also taught us about passenger rights. He said that if anyone ever tried to move us from seats we paid for, we should ask to see the specific complaints in writing and request to speak with the captain." The words hit Patricia like a slap, revealing that these weren't just random children she could intimidate with her manufactured authority. These were young girls who had been educated about their rights as passengers, who understood airline policies well enough to challenge discriminatory treatment, and who possessed a level of composure that suggested they came from a family that wouldn't quietly accept prejudicial behavior. "Your daddy?" Patricia's voice dripped with condescension as she bent down to eye level with the twins, her body language radiating the kind of aggressive intimidation that would have terrified most 13-year-olds. "And what exactly does your daddy do that makes him such an expert on airline regulations?" Maya and Mia exchanged a glance, the kind of wordless communication that only twins share. A split-second conversation that conveyed both their growing understanding that this woman was treating them unfairly and their mutual decision to handle the situation exactly as their father had taught them. "Our daddy works in the airline industry," Maya said simply, her voice steady despite the growing attention from other passengers who were beginning to realize they were witnessing something more serious than a seating mix-up. "He taught us that passengers have rights and that airline employees have to follow federal regulations about passenger treatment." The mention of federal regulations and passenger rights sent a chill through Patricia's confidence, though her prejudiced assumptions prevented her from recognizing the warning signs that she might be dealing with children who understood the aviation industry far better than she'd anticipated. Around the business-class cabin, other passengers were beginning to pull out their phones, instinctively recognizing that they were witnessing the kind of incident that needed to be documented. A young mother in seat 4B started recording, her protective instincts activated by watching two children face adult discrimination. A college student in seat 5A began live streaming to his social media followers, his commentary already generating comments from viewers who were outraged by what they were seeing. Federal regulations. Patricia laughed, a harsh sound that carried no humor and plenty of contempt. "Well, aren't you two little lawyers? Let me explain something about federal regulations. I'm the senior flight attendant on this aircraft, which means I have the authority to reseat passengers when their presence creates comfort issues for other travelers. And I'm telling you that you're creating a comfort issue." Mrs. Chun couldn't contain herself any longer. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she declared, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had raised 5 children and wasn't about to watch adults bully kids. "I've been on thousands of flights in my 78 years, and I have never seen anything as disgraceful as a grown woman harassing 2 well-behaved children with fake complaints. These girls haven't done anything wrong." The businessman in 3A was already on his phone, and Patricia caught a glimpse of him, typing what looked like a complaint or incident report. "I'm documenting this entire interaction," he announced to the cabin. "This is clearly discriminatory behavior, and these children are handling it with more maturity than the adult who's supposed to be serving them." Patricia felt her fabricated authority beginning to slip away as more passengers voiced their support for the twins and their criticism of her behavior. But instead of recognizing that her discriminatory actions were being exposed by multiple witnesses, instead of backing down from a course of action that was clearly wrong, she doubled down on her prejudiced assumptions and escalated the situation in a way that would soon cost her everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced loudly enough for the entire first-class section to hear, "I don't need passengers to tell me how to do my job. These girls are going to move to economy class where they belong. And if they refuse, I'll have the captain make that decision for them." The phrase "where they belong" hit the cabin like an explosion, stripping away any pretense that this was about passenger comfort or airline policies. Patricia had just revealed the racist foundation of her entire approach, the belief that two 13-year-old black girls didn't belong in first class, regardless of their tickets, their behavior, or their family's ability to pay for premium seating. Maya felt something shift inside her as the adult world revealed its capacity for casual cruelty. At 13, she was old enough to understand that she and her sister were being treated differently because of their race, but young enough to be shocked by the brazenness of it all. Her father had prepared them for moments like this, had taught them to remain calm and document everything. But experiencing discrimination firsthand was different from talking about it in the safety of their family dining room. "Mom," Maya said, her voice slightly shakier now, but still remarkably controlled for a 13-year-old facing adult hostility. "We paid for these seats just like everyone else. Our tickets say first class, and we haven't broken any rules or bothered anyone. If you're going to move us because of fake complaints, we want to speak to the captain, and we want everything documented in writing." The request for documentation and captain involvement revealed a level of procedural knowledge that made Patricia even more uncomfortable. These weren't ordinary children who would be intimidated by her authority. These were young girls who understood their rights and weren't afraid to exercise them despite their age and the pressure of adult disapproval. Mia, emboldened by her sister's courage and remembering their father's specific instructions about airline discrimination, added her own voice to the resistance. "Our daddy also told us that if anyone tried to remove us from seats we paid for without proper documentation, we should call him immediately so he can speak to the airline management about the situation." Patricia's laugh was bitter and dismissive. "Oh, your daddy's going to call airline management. That's precious. And exactly which airline does your daddy work for that makes him so important?" The twins exchanged another glance, this one carrying a weight that Patricia couldn't possibly understand. Their father had taught them to be humble about his position, to never use his authority as a weapon or a shield. But he'd also taught them that sometimes, when facing real discrimination, they needed to stand up for themselves and for other children who might not have the same protections. "He works for this airline," Maya said quietly, her voice carrying just enough weight to make several nearby passengers lean forward to listen more carefully. Patricia was too consumed by her prejudiced assumptions to process the implications of that simple statement. "Oh, your daddy works for the airline," she mocked, her voice dripping with disbelief. "Let me guess. He's a baggage handler, ground crew, maintenance worker. Well, I have news for you, little girl. I don't care who your daddy knows at the airport. I'm the senior flight attendant on this flight, and you're going to do what I say." The casual dismissal of their father's position, combined with the obvious classist assumptions about what kind of work he might do, revealed layers of prejudice that went beyond simple racial bias. Patricia wasn't just discriminating against two children because of their skin color. She was making assumptions about their family's economic status, their father's education and position, and their right to occupy premium seating based on nothing more than her own biased worldview. What Patricia didn't know, what her prejudices prevented her from recognizing, was that Maya and Mia Wellington were about to make a phone call that would change everything about her attitude, her career, and her understanding of exactly who she had chosen to discriminate against. As the twins calmly reached for Mia's phone, the latest iPhone that their father had given them for safety and communication during their travels, Patricia had no idea that she was 60 seconds away from discovering that the daddy she'd been mocking was actually David Wellington, Chief Executive Officer of the airline she worked for. The call that was about to connect would not only end Patricia's career, but trigger the largest investigation of employee discrimination in the airline's history, leading to policy changes that would protect children from exactly the kind of prejudicial treatment she just demonstrated. But in that moment, as 13-year-old Maya calmly scrolled through her contacts to find Daddy, Patricia Morrison still believed she held all the power in the situation. She still thought she was dealing with two ordinary children who could be intimidated, moved, and dismissed without consequences. She was about to learn how catastrophically wrong her assumptions had been. Have you ever witnessed adults discriminating against children simply because of their race or age? These two 13-year-old girls are about to make a phone call that will shock everyone on this flight and expose the ugly truth about how some airline employees treat young passengers. If you want to see how their father responds when he discovers his own daughters are being discriminated against on his airline, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will restore your faith in justice and prove that sometimes the people you underestimate have exactly the power needed to change everything. Patricia Morrison stood in the first-class aisle, her 15 years of airline experience having taught her exactly how to intimidate passengers who dared to question her authority. She'd perfected the art of using her uniform as a weapon, her seniority as a shield, and the confined space of an aircraft as her personal domain, where she believed her word was absolute law. But today, she was facing two 13-year-old girls who weren't intimidated by her tactics, and that only made her more determined to assert her discriminatory authority over children she believed didn't belong in premium seating. The tension in the first-class cabin was suffocating as passengers who had been casually reading magazines and enjoying pre-flight champagne found themselves witnessing what many would later describe as one of the most blatant displays of racial discrimination against children they'd ever seen. At 30,000 F2, phone cameras were already recording. Social media posts were being drafted, and the moral outrage was building among adults who couldn't believe they were watching a grown woman systematically harass two well-behaved teenagers. "Let me make this very clear to you girls," Patricia announced, her voice loud enough to carry throughout the premium cabin. "I have received specific complaints from multiple passengers about hygiene issues, and federal aviation regulations require me to address passenger comfort concerns immediately. This isn't personal. This is policy." The lie was so transparent that it insulted the intelligence of everyone within hearing distance. Mrs. Chen in seat 1C had been on the aircraft since the first boarding group and had witnessed Maya and Mia's arrival. Two impeccably dressed young ladies who had quietly settled into their seats with books and had caused no disturbance whatsoever. "This is absolutely absurd," Mrs. Chin declared, her voice carrying the moral authority of a grandmother who had raised 5 children and wasn't about to watch adults bully kids. "I've been sitting 3F'd away from these young ladies for 45 minutes, and there is absolutely no odor of any kind. They've been perfect passengers, quiet, polite, and well-behaved. This is clearly discriminatory treatment. The businessman in seat 3 looked up from his phone where he'd been documenting the incident. "I'm an attorney specializing in civil rights law," he announced to the cabin. "And what I'm witnessing here is textbook discrimination against minors. These children have done nothing wrong, and this flight attendant is fabricating complaints to justify moving them based solely on their race." Patricia felt her fabricated authority being challenged by passengers who clearly understood discrimination when they saw it. But instead of backing down, she doubled down on her false claims with even more outrageous assertions designed to provide cover for her prejudicial treatment of the twins. "The complaints didn't come from this section," she said, her voice rising with defensive anger. "First-class passengers in the forward cabin expressed concerns during boarding, and I'm required to investigate all passenger comfort issues regardless of where they originate. I don't make these decisions lightly, but passenger safety and comfort are my primary responsibilities." Maya, who had been quietly observing the adults around her defend her and her sister, spoke up with the careful precision her father had taught her for dealing with discriminatory situations. "Mom, could you please provide us with the names of the passengers who complained, the specific nature of their complaints, and the documentation you're required to maintain for passenger removal decisions under federal aviation law?" The question hit Patricia like a thunderbolt. This 13-year-old girl was using technical aviation terminology, referencing federal regulations, and requesting documentation with the same precision that corporate lawyers used in discrimination lawsuits. Mia's knowledge of passenger rights and airline obligations suggested she came from a family that understood the aviation industry at levels that exceeded Patricia's own training. "I don't have to provide documentation to passengers," Patricia stammered, but her voice lacked the conviction it had carried just moments earlier when she'd felt confident in her ability to intimidate 2 children. "Actually, under CFR Title 14, Section 382, you do," said Mia quietly, her voice carrying knowledge that made several nearby passengers lean forward in surprise. "Airlines are required to provide specific documentation for any passenger removal, including the regulatory basis for the action and the factual justification for discriminatory treatment. Our daddy taught us about passenger rights because he said some people might try to treat us unfairly." The mention of specific federal aviation regulations by a 13-year-old girl sent shock waves through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances of amazement, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Children who possessed knowledge of airline operations that exceeded that of the flight attendants, supposedly serving them. Patricia's face flushed red as she realized she was being outmaneuvered by teenagers who understood federal aviation law better than she did. Her 15 years of discriminatory behavior had never prepared her for passengers, especially child passengers, who could challenge her authority with precise legal citations and procedural requirements. "You little girls think you're smart with your legal terminology," Patricia snapped, her professional mask slipping to reveal the ugly prejudice underneath. "But I've been doing this job since before you were born. I know how to handle disruptive passengers who refuse to follow airline policies." Disruptive. The college student live streaming from seat 5A looked up from his phone, where thousands of viewers were watching the discrimination unfold in real time. These kids have been sitting quietly reading books for the entire boarding process. The only disruption I see is a flight attendant harassing children based on their race. The young mother recording from seat 4B nodded emphatically. "I have 3 kids of my own, and if anyone treated my daughters like this, there would be serious consequences. This is absolutely unacceptable behavior from an airline employee." Mrs. Chun was pulling out her own phone to call her son, who worked as a federal prosecutor, specializing in civil rights cases. "I'm documenting everything for legal purposes," she announced. "This discriminatory treatment of children needs to be reported to the proper authorities." Patricia felt the situation spiraling beyond her control as more passengers actively supported the twins and documented her behavior for legal and social media purposes. But instead of recognizing that her discriminatory actions were being exposed by multiple witnesses, instead of backing down from a course of action that was clearly wrong, she escalated with a threat that would soon prove to be the biggest mistake of her career. "Fine," she declared loud enough for the entire first-class section to hear. "If you two want to play lawyer with your passenger rights and federal regulations, then I'll treat this as a serious disciplinary matter. Either you move to economy class voluntarily, or I'll have the captain declare this a security incident and have you removed from the aircraft entirely." The threat sent gasps throughout the cabin. Patricia was now threatening to have 2 13-year-old girls removed from the aircraft for the crime of refusing to accept discriminatory treatment. The escalation from fabricated odor complaints to security threats revealed the depth of her prejudice and her willingness to abuse airline authority to target children based on race. Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach as she realized this adult was prepared to have her and her sister forcibly removed from the airplane for refusing to give up seats they'd paid for. At 13, she was beginning to understand that the world contained people who would use their authority to hurt children simply because they could. "Mom," Maya said, her voice slightly shakier now, but still remarkably controlled for a child facing adult hostility. "We haven't done anything disruptive or dangerous. We're just trying to get to Miami to see our daddy. If you're going to call this a security incident, we want to speak to the captain ourselves, and we want everything recorded officially." Mia, emboldened by her sister's courage and remembering their father's specific instructions about airline discrimination, added her own voice to their defense. "Our daddy told us that if anyone ever threatened to have us removed from a flight for fake reasons, we should call him immediately so he can protect us and make sure we're treated fairly." Patricia's laugh was harsh and dismissive, revealing her complete underestimation of exactly who she was dealing with. "Oh yes, let's call Daddy so he can complain to customer service about the mean flight attendant. I'm sure that will solve everything." The mockery in her voice was unmistakable, as was her assumption that the twins' father was powerless to challenge her authority or hold her accountable for discriminatory treatment of his children. Patricia had spent 15 years targeting passengers she believed couldn't fight back, and she'd grown comfortable with the power dynamics that allowed her to treat certain families. However, her prejudices dictated. "Actually," Maya said quietly, reaching into her designer handbag for the iPhone her father had given her for safety and communication, "our daddy specifically told us to call him if anyone on his airline ever treated us badly." His airline, Patricia scoffed, not processing the implications of Maya's careful word choice. "What does your daddy do? Work in the mailroom? Baggage claim? Let me guess. He's a mechanic who thinks he knows how airlines operate." The casual assumptions about their father's position, combined with the dismissive tone about working-class jobs, revealed additional layers of prejudice that went beyond racial discrimination. Patricia wasn't just targeting these children because of their skin color. She was making classist assumptions about their family's economic status and social position based on nothing more than her own biased worldview. What Patricia didn't understand was that Mia's careful phrasing, his airline rather than the airline, was about to transform everything about this situation. The phone call the 13-year-old was preparing to make would connect directly to the chief executive officer of the airline, a man who was about to discover that his own employees were discriminating against his daughters on his aircraft. As Maya scrolled through her contacts to find Daddy's office, Passengers throughout the first-class cabin held their breath, sensing that they were about to witness something unprecedented. The twins' calm confidence, their knowledge of aviation regulations, their expensive clothing and electronics, their articulate responses to adult discrimination. It all suggested that Patricia had made a catastrophic miscalculation about exactly who she had chosen to target with her prejudicial behavior. The businessman's attorney was already drafting incident reports that would be filed with federal aviation authorities. Mrs. Chun was preparing to call her prosecutor's son with evidence of discrimination against minors. The college students' live stream had attracted 50,000 viewers who were demanding justice for the two girls being harassed by airline personnel. But none of the passengers, despite their outrage and support, could have imagined that Maya Wellington was 60 seconds away from calling the chief executive officer of the airline to report that his employees were discriminating against his daughters. The conversation that was about to take place would not only end Patricia's career, but trigger systemic changes in how airlines train employees about child passenger rights and discrimination prevention. Patricia Morrison stood in the aisle of Flight 847, completely unaware that her 15-year pattern of discriminatory behavior was about to collide with the ultimate accountability. A father's protective fury combined with corporate authority that could transform her actions into a company-wide case study of what happens when employees target the wrong children with their prejudices. The phone in Maya's hand was about to connect to a conversation that would change everything, not just for Patricia, but for every airline employee who might think they can discriminate against passengers with impunity. What would you do if you witnessed a flight attendant threatening to remove two 13-year-old girls from a plane simply because of their race? Subscribe now to see what happens when Maya calls her father and reveals the shocking truth that will leave everyone speechless. The first-class cabin of Flight 847 had transformed from a space of luxury into a battlefield where adult prejudice was confronting childhood innocence. And Maya Wellington held her phone with the steady determination of a 13-year-old who had been taught that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when the adults around you are behaving badly. Patricia Morrison stood in the aisle, her confidence wavering for the first time as she watched Maya calmly scroll through her contacts with the kind of purposeful precision that suggested this wasn't an empty threat or childish bluff. Something about the twins' composure, their knowledge of aviation regulations, and their unshakable certainty that their father would protect them was beginning to penetrate Patricia's prejudiced assumptions about powerless children she could intimidate without consequences. "Go ahead and call your daddy," Patricia said. But her voice lacked the mocking confidence it had carried just moments earlier. "I'm sure he'll be very interested to hear that his daughters are being disruptive on an aircraft and refusing to follow crew instructions for the safety and comfort of other passengers." Maya looked up from her phone with the kind of direct gaze that made adults uncomfortable when it came from children who clearly understood more about the situation than they should have to. "At 13 years old, our daddy taught us the difference between legitimate crew instructions and discriminatory harassment," she said quietly. "He also taught us that some adults will try to use their authority to hurt children who can't defend themselves." The words hit the cabin like a revelation, carrying implications that went far beyond a simple seating dispute. These weren't just any 13-year-olds who happened to be articulate and well-dressed. These were children who had been specifically educated about discrimination, who understood their rights as passengers, and who possessed knowledge about airline operations that suggested their families' involvement in the aviation industry went deeper than Patricia had realized. Mia, emboldened by her sister's courage and the visible support from passengers throughout the cabin, added her own voice to their resistance. "Our daddy always told us that If we're ever treated unfairly on an airplane, we should stay calm, be polite, document everything, and call him immediately so he can make sure we're protected. The mention of documentation and protection carried weight that made several passengers lean forward with increased interest. Mrs. Chen was openly recording the interaction now, her phone capturing every word of Patricia's discriminatory behavior. The attorney in seat 3A was typing rapidly on his laptop, creating what appeared to be an official incident report. The college students' live stream had attracted over 70,000 viewers who were posting increasingly angry comments about the treatment of the two girls. Patricia felt the walls of accountability closing in around her as she realized that multiple passengers were actively documenting her behavior and broadcasting it to thousands of people who were witnessing her discrimination against children in real time. But instead of recognizing that she should de-escalate the situation and apologize for her mistake, her pride and prejudice drove her toward one final catastrophic escalation. "I don't care who your daddy thinks he is," she declared, her voice rising with defensive anger. "And I don't care what kind of connections you think he has. I am the senior flight attendant on this aircraft, which means I have the authority to remove passengers who create disruptions or refuse to follow legitimate crew instructions. And that's exactly what's going to happen if you don't move to economy class right now." The threat was clear and unmistakable. Patricia was prepared to have two 13-year-old girls forcibly removed from the aircraft for the crime of refusing to accept discriminatory treatment based on fabricated complaints. The escalation revealed the depth of her prejudice and her fundamental misunderstanding of exactly who she was threatening. Maya exchanged a glance with her sister, and in that moment of twin communication, they made the decision that would change everything about Patricia's understanding of power, authority, and consequences. "Mia," Mia said quietly, "I think it's time to call Daddy." She pressed the contact labeled Daddy's office and held the phone to her ear, while Patricia watched with a mixture of curiosity and disdain, still convinced that she was about to hear a 13-year-old complain to her father about a mean flight attendant who would have no power to challenge airline authority or hold employees accountable for their behavior. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered with a warm tone reserved for calls from his daughters. "Maya, sweetheart, is everything okay? You should be in the air by now." Maya's voice remained steady despite the emotion she felt at hearing her father's protective concern. "Hi, Daddy. We're still on the ground in Chicago, and we're having a problem with one of your flight attendants. She's trying to make us move to economy class because she says passengers complained about our body odor, but that's not true. She's being mean to us, and she won't listen when we tell her about passenger rights." The words, "your flight attendants," hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Though Patricia was too focused on her dismissive assumptions about powerless parents to process the implications of Mia's specific phrasing, she says passengers complained about us. But the other people in first class say that's not true, and they're recording everything because they think she's discriminating against us because we're black. She threatened to have us removed from the plane if we didn't give up our seats. Patricia could hear the deep male voice responding through the phone, but couldn't make out the specific words. What she could detect was a tone that was shifting from paternal concern to something much more serious and authoritative. "What's the flight attendant's name, sweetheart?" the voice asked, now audible to anyone standing close to Maya. "Her name tag says Patricia Morrison," Mia replied, looking directly at the woman who had been harassing her and her sister for the past 20 minutes. Patricia felt a chill run down her spine as she heard her full name being reported to whoever was on the other end of that phone call. But she was still too consumed by her prejudiced assumptions to understand that she was being reported directly to the chief executive officer of her airline. And Maya, what did you tell her about passenger rights and federal aviation regulations? I told her what you taught us about CFR Title 14 and passenger removal requirements. And Mia mentioned the documentation rules for discriminatory treatment, but she just got madder and said we were being disruptive for knowing about airline policies. The cabin had fallen completely silent as passengers realized they were hearing one side of a conversation that was clearly more significant than an ordinary parent complaint. The technical terminology, the reference to federal regulations, the calm way Maya was reporting discriminatory behavior, it all suggested that this phone call was connected to someone with serious authority in the aviation industry. "Daddy," Maya continued, her voice still steady, but carrying the slight tremor of a 13-year-old who was trying to be brave while facing adult cruelty. "She keeps saying we don't belong in first class and that we have to move where we belong. She's being really mean, and all the other passengers are upset about how she's treating us." The phrase "where we belong" had been clearly audible to passengers throughout the cabin, and the racist implications hadn't been lost on anyone witnessing the discrimination. Mrs. Chen was shaking her head in disgust. The attorney was typing furiously, and the college student was providing live commentary to his increasingly outraged audience. Patricia watched Mia's face as she listened to her father's response, and for the first time, she noticed something that made her stomach clench with the first stirrings of real concern. The 13-year-old's expression was shifting from worried to relieved, to something that looked almost like anticipation. "Okay, Daddy, I'll tell her," Maya said, and then looked up at Patricia with the kind of direct gaze that suddenly made the flight attendant feel very uncomfortable about the entire situation. "My daddy wants to speak with you," Maya said simply, holding out the phone with the calm confidence of a child who knew that adult authority was about to shift dramatically in her favor. Patricia took the phone with hands that were beginning to shake slightly, though she couldn't quite identify why she was feeling nervous about talking to the father of 2 children she'd been harassing with impunity just minutes earlier. "Hello," she said into the phone, trying to maintain her professional demeanor, while speaking to what she assumed was an angry parent who would have no real power to challenge her authority or hold her accountable for discriminatory behavior. Ms. Morrison, the voice on the other end, was calm, measured, and carried an authority that made Patricia's blood run cold. "This is David Wellington, Chief Executive Officer of the airline you work for. You have just spent 20 minutes discriminating against my daughters based on fabricated complaints, false accusations, and racial prejudice. You have threatened to remove 2 13-year-old girls from an aircraft for refusing to accept treatment that violates every civil rights policy this company has ever implemented." The words hit Patricia like a series of physical blows, each phrase carrying implications that destroyed her understanding of the situation and her place within it. "Chief Executive Officer, my daughter's civil rights violations. The twins she'd been harassing weren't just ordinary passengers. They were the children of the man who owned the airline, who could end her career with a single phone call, who was now personally aware of every discriminatory action she'd taken." Patricia felt her legs go weak as the magnitude of her mistake crashed over her like a tsunami. She hadn't just discriminated against 2 random children. She had systematically harassed, threatened, and attempted to remove the daughters of the chief executive officer of her airline, documenting her own racist behavior in front of dozens of witnesses who were recording everything for legal and social media purposes. "Mr. Wellington, I didn't know. I was just following airline policy for passenger comfort," she stammered, but the words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. "You are following no policy that exists at this airline," David Wellington's voice cut through her excuses with surgical precision. You fabricated passenger complaints, engaged in discriminatory treatment of minor passengers, threatened removal based on false accusations, and revealed racial bias that violates federal civil rights law and every principle this company stands for. The COS words were audible to passengers throughout the cabin who were witnessing the moment when discriminatory behavior met ultimate corporate accountability. The attorney was already preparing federal civil rights complaints. Mrs. Chun was calling her prosecutor's son with evidence of discrimination against the So children, and the college students' audience had grown to over 100,000 viewers who were watching corporate justice unfold in real time. Patricia realized that her 15 years of discriminatory behavior had finally targeted the wrong children, and the consequences were about to be swift, severe, and permanent. Have you ever seen discrimination backfire so spectacularly when the wrong family was targeted? Subscribe now to witness what happens when the CEO of an airline discovers his employees have been harassing his own daughters. The fallout will shock you. The silence in the first-class cabin was deafening as Patricia Morrison held the phone with trembling hands, her entire world collapsing around her as she processed the reality that she had just spent 20 minutes systematically discriminating against the daughters of the chief executive officer of her airline. The man on the other end of the call wasn't just any angry parent. He was David Wellington, the person who controlled every aspect of her employment, her career, and her future in the aviation industry. Ms. Morrison. David Wellington's voice continued with the calm authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of passengers. I want you to understand something very clearly. In the 15 minutes since my daughters called me, I have reviewed your employment file, your passenger complaint history, and the pattern of discriminatory behavior that has been documented against you over the past several years. Patricia felt the blood drain from her face as she realized that her pattern of targeting minority passengers had been tracked and documented in corporate files she'd assumed were either ignored or forgotten. Her systematic racism hadn't gone unnoticed. It had been building toward exactly this kind of catastrophic confrontation with accountability. According to airline records, Wellington continued, his voice carrying the weight of corporate authority that could destroy careers with a few keystrokes. You have been involved in 17 passenger removal incidents over the past 5 years. 14 of those incidents involved minority passengers. 12 resulted in complaints to the Department of Transportation. And now you've targeted my daughters with the same discriminatory behavior that has made you a liability to this company and a violation of our civil rights commitments. The passengers in the first-class cabin were listening to corporate justice unfold in real time, witnessing the moment when systematic discrimination met ultimate accountability. Mrs. Chen was openly weeping with relief that someone with real power was finally holding an employee accountable for racist behavior. The attorney was documenting everything for what would become landmark civil rights litigation. The college students' live stream audience had grown to over 200,000 viewers who were watching the most dramatic example of workplace consequences they'd ever seen. But, sir, I was just following standard procedures for passenger comfort complaints, Patricia stammered, her voice shaking as she tried to salvage a career that was already over. I received reports about hygiene issues, and I was addressing them according to airline policy. You received no reports. Wellington's voice cut through her lies with surgical precision. I have access to all passenger communications, crew reports, and incident documentation for this flight. There were no complaints of any kind about my daughters. You fabricated those reports to justify discriminatory treatment based on racial prejudice, and you did it in front of dozens of witnesses who have been recording your behavior. The brutal honesty of his assessment left no room for denial or excuse. Patricia had been caught in her lies by someone with access to all airline records, all employee communications, and all passenger feedback systems. Her fabricated complaints about odor had been exposed as racist fiction by the person with ultimate authority to verify or disprove her claims. Maya and Mia sat in their seats, watching the adult who had been harassing them face consequences for discriminatory behavior they shouldn't have had to endure at 13 years old. Their father's protective fury was being channeled through corporate authority that would ensure Patricia's racism would have permanent repercussions extending far beyond this single incident. Furthermore, Wellington continued, his voice taking on the tone of an executive delivering a termination decision. My daughters report that you use the phrase where they belong when ordering them to move to economy class. That language reveals racial prejudice that violates federal civil rights law and every anti-discrimination policy this airline has implemented. You have exposed this company to massive civil rights litigation while traumatizing 2 children who were traveling alone under our care. Patricia's knees buckled as she realized that her racist language had been reported directly to the CEO by his own daughters, creating an unimpeachable record of discriminatory intent that would be used in federal civil rights prosecutions and civil lawsuits that could cost the airline millions of dollars. Mr. Wellington, please. I've worked for this airline for 15 years. I made a mistake, but I can learn from this and do better. Please don't end my career over one incident, Patricia begged, her voice breaking, as she recognized that her systematic racism had finally met consequences she couldn't escape or minimize. This isn't one incident, Ms. Morrison, Wellington replied with the finality of someone who had reviewed extensive documentation of employee misconduct. This is a pattern of discriminatory behavior that has been building toward exactly this kind of federal civil rights violation. You have spent 15 years targeting passengers based on race, and today you targeted my daughters. The consequences will be proportional to the systematic nature of your discrimination. The SOS words carried implications that went far beyond simple employment termination, federal civil rights violations, systematic discrimination, civil rights litigation. Patricia was facing not just the loss of her job, but potential criminal prosecution and civil liability that could destroy her financially and legally. David Wellington's voice softened slightly as he addressed his daughters directly. Maya, Mia, are you both okay? Has anyone else on the crew treated you poorly, or is this isolated to Ms. Morrison? Maya took the phone back from Patricia's shaking hands and spoke with the composed dignity that had characterized her response to discrimination throughout the entire incident. We're okay, Daddy. The other passengers have been really nice and supportive. They've been recording everything and saying that what she did was wrong. But we're ready to come home now. I know you are, sweetheart, and I'm proud of how you and Mia handled this situation. You remembered everything I taught you about staying calm, documenting discrimination, and protecting your rights. But you shouldn't have had to use those lessons against my own employees. The paternal pride mixed with corporate fury in Wellington's voice was audible throughout the cabin, creating a moment that passengers would remember for the rest of their lives. A father's love for his children combined with a Sioux power to ensure justice would be swift and comprehensive. Maya, I want you to put the phone on speaker, so everyone in the cabin can hear what I'm about to say, Wellington instructed. Maya pressed the speaker button, and suddenly David Wellington's voice filled the first-class cabin with authority that commanded immediate attention from every passenger and crew member within hearing distance. Ladies and gentlemen, this is David Wellington, Chief Executive Officer of this airline. I want to apologize to everyone who has witnessed the discriminatory behavior of our employee, Patricia Morrison. What you have seen today violates every principle of equality, respect, and human dignity that this company stands for. The passengers erupted in murmurs of surprise and vindication, realizing they had been witnessing history, the moment when corporate leadership took direct responsibility for employee racism and implemented immediate accountability measures. Ms. Morrison, Wellington continued, his voice now carrying the formal tone of corporate discipline, you are hereby terminated from employment, with this airline effective immediately. Security will escort you from the aircraft, and you will be banned from all airline facilities permanently. Your discriminatory behavior against my daughters and your documented pattern of racist treatment of passengers has made you unemployable in this industry. Patricia collapsed into an empty seat, her career destroyed, her reputation ruined, her systematic racism finally meeting consequences that would follow her for the rest of her life. 15 years of discriminatory behavior had been ended by 20 minutes of targeting the wrong children with her prejudiced assumptions. To the passengers who supported my daughters and documented this discrimination, thank you for standing up against racism and protecting 2 children who were facing adult prejudice. Your actions today will be instrumental in the civil rights reforms this airline will implement to ensure this never happens again. The cabin erupted in applause as passengers realized they had been part of something historic, a moment when discrimination met ultimate accountability, when children were protected by adult allies, and when corporate power was used to enforce civil rights rather than ignore them. This aircraft will return to the gate where Ms. Morrison will be removed, and federal civil rights investigators will interview all witnesses. My daughters will be transferred to my private aircraft for travel to Miami, and every passenger on this flight will receive full compensation and upgraded accommodations as our apology for the discriminatory behavior you witnessed. Patricia Morrison sat in stunned silence. Her discriminatory career ended by her failure to recognize that Maya and Mia Wellington were exactly the wrong children to target with systematic racism. Her prejudiced assumptions about Poe